Welcome to A Slice of Therapy. This podcast was created with Anchor. And if you've not heard of Anchor, let me explain. It's free. It's a really easy way to make a podcast. And it helps me because I can just do this every day directly into my phone, because there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. So if you fancy making a podcast too, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. So yesterday was the birthday of Ringo Starr, the drummer for the Beatles. He was 80, in fact. And it reminded me of this story when the Beatles were in the middle of recording what many regard as their best album, the White Album. In fact, it's my favourite Beatles album. In fact, more than that, it's my favourite record, full stop. And yet in the middle of that, Ringo Starr, known to be their happy-go-lucky drummer, just couldn't take it anymore. The thing is, it was tough for Ringo. The other three had been together longer. He'd come in on the back end of things. They'd bonded through the days of Hamburg. They'd been the Beatles from the outset, but Ringo hadn't. He'd been a hurricane rather than the Beatle. During those months in Hamburg, it was Pete Best who was the Beatles drummer, and Ringo was drumming for Rory Storm and the Hurricanes back in Liverpool. So Ringo came later. He was the add-on when they let Pete go. And there've been plenty to bond them since, of course. John, Paul, George and Ringo, they shared the craziness of Beatles mania together. They broke America together. They were in each other's pockets for years. They were brothers now, basically. But during the recording of this White Album, something was eating away at Ringo. Something was telling him that he was the outsider. Something was telling him the others didn't like him that much. He'd see John, Paul and George, the original Beatles, and he saw their togetherness. And it was a togetherness that he felt excluded from. So he didn't feel good. He was sat there in the studio, not feeling part of it, and he'd had enough. So in the middle of recording this incredible album, Ringo decided that he was quitting the Beatles. So he visits John first, and he plucks up the courage to knock on the door of John's room, and John invites him in, and Ringo laid his soul bare. He said, "Look, I just don't feel right. I don't feel that I'm part of this. You three seem so close." And John looked stunned. "Wow," he said. "I thought it was you three that were so close." Of course, now Ringo was confused, so he went to visit Paul to tell Paul why he'd decided to quit. He said, "Paul, I don't feel part of this. You three are so close." And this time it was Paul who looked stunned. He said, "Wow, I thought it was you three." And Ringo didn't bother reaching George. He no longer needed to. He realised that every Beatle was actually feeling the same insecurity that he was. They were all thinking, the other three like each other more than they like me. And so every single Beatle at the very same time was telling themselves the same story. I don't belong here, they thought. So he didn't quit the Beatles. He picked up his drumsticks and had fun being a Beatle again. But it reminds me that Ringo's virtue was that he decided to be honest and he decided to be vulnerable. He shared what was really going on for him. He could have handled it differently. He could have felt angry at the exclusion that he was imagining. He could have attacked the others for this imagined crime that he thought that they were all involved in. But instead he shared what he felt. He could have bombarded them verbally. He could have told them they were a terrible bunch for how they were treating him. And not only would he have quit the band if he'd done that, but he'd have lost three of his best pals, all for a story that wasn't true, and in fact the others were secretly sharing as well. And this is the thing about stories, isn't it? These stories that we can accept as gospel. This kind of storytelling creature, its favourite trick is to persuade us of things that are just not true. And the thing about stories that we tell ourselves is that they have power. So those stories get in the way of our fullest life. They get in the way of our hopes, our dreams, and, as nearly happened with Ringo, our friendships. And they stunt our potential because often they'll persuade us to edit ourselves too. They'll limit our confidence. They can even make a person quit the Beatles. They can get in the way of us reaching out for opportunities that would enrich us. They can get in the way of the social connections we long for. Stories like, oh, I won't belong, or they won't like me, or I'm not good enough. And yet, as Ringo found, it was all imagination. But how powerful these stories are that they can actually change the things that we do. Knowing this then, how powerful it could be if we change our stories to ones that fuel us rather than limit us. In many ways, this is the fundamental job of personal change, isn't it? To begin with one set of stories and then rewrite them. To start with a story that limits us and then finish with a story that sets us free. Ringo's story, like many of our stories, actually wasn't true. It was an imagining. It was something that made him very nearly do something that he surely would have regretted later. It edited him. It stopped him having fun while he was making one of the greatest albums of all time, with the greatest band of all time. So what would it be like to tell ourselves stories that don't trim our wings, but actually help us to soar? So if you like this episode, please do share it so other people can get the benefit as well. You can work with me directly. I'm Alun Parry. You can find me at liverpoolpsychotherapy.co.uk. And of course, please do subscribe to the podcast. It's completely free and you'll never miss an episode again. So thanks for listening, and I'll be back tomorrow with another one.